Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Tonight, I invite you to settle in, dim the lights, and let your imagination drift into the shadows, because what you're about to hear are not just stories. They're chilling reminders of how fate, chance, and the smallest decisions can stand between us and the unthinkable. These are true accounts from people who, by a matter of seconds, escaped death itself. Sometimes it's the wrong turn, the missed call, or the inexplicable feeling that keeps us alive. And sometimes it's something we can't explain at all. Our first story comes from a man named Daniel, who, like so many of us, was just trying to get home after a long, exhausting day. But what happened to him on a lonely stretch of highway one rainy night would haunt him for years to come, and make him question everything he thought he knew about luck, fate, and the invisible threads that tie our lives together. Daniel had always been a creature of habit. He worked the late shift at a small manufacturing plant on the outskirts of town, and every night, he'd clock out at exactly 11 p.m., walk to his car, and drive the same route home. It was a routine he could do in his sleep, and sometimes he nearly did. The drive was a straight shot down the interstate, then a quick exit onto a winding country road that led to his quiet neighborhood. He'd done it so many times, he barely noticed the scenery anymore. But on this particular night, everything felt just a little bit off. The rain had started around sunset, and by the time Daniel left work, it was coming down in sheets, turning the world outside his windshield into a blur of headlights and reflections. He was more tired than usual, his eyelids heavy, his mind drifting as he navigated the familiar roads. He kept telling himself to stay alert, to focus, but the rhythmic sound of the wipers and the hum of the engine lulled him into a kind of trance. He was about 10 minutes from home when it happened. He was supposed to take exit 14, a narrow ramp that curved sharply off the interstate and led to the back roads he knew so well. But as he approached the exit, a semi-truck in the next lane splashed a wave of water across his windshield, blinding him for a split second. By the time he cleared the water and regained his bearings, he'd missed the exit entirely. Daniel cursed under his breath, annoyed at himself and the truck driver. He'd have to take the next exit, which meant doubling back and adding at least 10 minutes to his already long night. He considered pulling over to check his GPS, but he knew the area well enough to find his way. Still, the detour put him in a foul mood. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white, as he navigated the unfamiliar stretch of highway that as he drove. He noticed how empty the road was. The rain had kept most people indoors, and the only other cars he saw were distant pairs of red taillights, quickly swallowed by the darkness. The world felt strangely silent. The only sounds the hiss of the tires on wet pavement and the steady thump of his heart in his chest. He finally reached the next exit, took it, and began the slow process of winding his way back toward home. The detour took him through a part of town he rarely visited. Old warehouses, shuttered gas stations, and empty lots, all bathed in the sickly orange glow of streetlights. He felt a prickle of unease, but he told himself it was just the lateness of the hour and the unfamiliar surroundings. When he finally pulled into his driveway, it was nearly midnight. He killed the engine, sat in the silence for a moment, and let out a long sigh. He was just glad to be home. He grabbed his bag, locked the car, and hurried inside, eager to put the night behind him. He was asleep within minutes, the rain still tapping against the windows as he drifted off. He didn't think about the missed exit again, at least, not until the next morning, when his phone started buzzing with calls and texts before he'd even had a chance to open his eyes. The first message was from his mother. "Are you okay? Please call me as soon as you get this." The next was from his sister. "Daniel, please tell me you're all right. I saw the news." His heart began to race as he scrolled through the notifications, each one more frantic than the last. He turned on the TV, and there it was, breaking news, live footage from the interstate, flashing lights, twisted metal, and a line of emergency vehicles stretching as far as the eye could see. The reporter's voice was somber as she described a massive pileup that had occurred just after 11 p.m. the night before, right at exit 14. Daniel's blood ran cold as he listened to the details. A semi-truck had jackknifed it on the slick ramp, blocking the exit and causing a chain reaction as car after car slammed into the wreckage. Several vehicles had caught fire, and the authorities were still working to identify the victims. The accident had happened at exactly the time Daniel would have been there. If he hadn't missed his exit, he sat in stunned silence, the reality of what had happened slowly sinking in. If he hadn't been blinded by that wave of water, if he hadn't missed his exit, he would have been right in the middle of that pileup. The thought made him shiver. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind, wondering how close he'd come to dying, how easily his life could have ended in a flash of twisted metal and fire. Over the next few days, Daniel found himself haunted by the what-ifs. He read every news article, watched every update, and scanned the list of victims, half expecting to see a name he recognized. He didn't know any of them personally, but that didn't make it any easier. He felt a strange sense of guilt, as if he'd been spared for no reason while others hadn't been so lucky. He tried to go back to his routine, but everything felt different now. The drive to work was no longer automatic. Every turn, every intersection, every decision felt loaded with meaning. He found himself hyper-aware of his surroundings, double-checking every mirror, every blind spot, every exit sign. The rain, once a soothing backdrop, now made his heart race. He started having nightmares, visions of twisted metal, flashing lights, and the sound of sirens echoing in the distance. In his dreams, he was always trapped in his car, unable to move, as the world around him burned. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the memory of the missed exit lingering like a ghost. Daniel's friends and family tried to comfort him, telling him he was lucky, that he'd been given a second chance. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd cheated death, that he was living on borrowed time. He became obsessed with the idea of fate. Was it just luck, or was there something more at work? Had some unseen force intervened, or was it all just random chance? He started noticing other moments in his life where things could have gone differently. A missed bus, a delayed flight, a forgotten appointment. Each one felt like a thread in a vast, invisible web, connecting him to a future he couldn't see. He wondered how many times he'd unknowingly skirted disaster, how many times a split-second decision had saved his life. One night, a few weeks after the accident, Daniel found himself driving home in the rain again. The roads were slick, the world outside his windshield a blur of color and light. As he approached exit 14, he felt a surge of anxiety, his hands trembling on the wheel. He slowed down, checked his mirrors, and took the exit with extra caution, his heart pounding in his chest. As he merged onto the back road, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but darkness. The road behind him was empty, the world silent except for the steady drum of rain on the roof. He let out a shaky breath, feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. He realized then that he would never drive that stretch of road the same way again. The memory of that night, the missed exit, the pile-up, the lives lost, would always be with him, a constant reminder of how fragile life could be. He didn't know why he'd been spared, but he knew he couldn't take it for granted. In the months that followed, Daniel tried to make sense of what had happened. He talked to friends, family, even a therapist, trying to process the guilt and fear that lingered. He started volunteering at a local shelter, hoping to give back in some small way. He reached out to the families of the victims, offering condolences and support, though he never told them about his own close call that he still had nightmares. But they became less frequent over time. He learned to live with the uncertainty, to accept that some questions would never have answers. He became more present, more grateful for the little things: a warm bed, a hot meal, the sound of rain on the roof. He knew that life could change in an instant, that every moment was a gift. And sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and the rain was falling, he'd think back to that night on the highway, the wrong turn, the missed exit, the twist of fate that had saved his life by seconds. He'd wonder what might have happened if things had gone differently, if he'd taken the exit as usual. But he knew that some stories were better left untold, some mysteries better left unsolved. All he could do was keep moving forward, one day at a time, grateful for the chance to do so. Because sometimes, it's the smallest moments, the missed exit, the wrong turn, the split-second decision, that make all the difference. And sometimes, that's all it takes to escape death by seconds. There are moments in life when the ordinary becomes extraordinary, when the mundane routine of a day is shattered by a single, inexplicable event. For some, these moments are marked by joy or revelation. For others, they are defined by terror, by the sudden, chilling realization of how close we come to the edge without ever knowing it. This is the story of Olivia, a woman whose life was saved by a stubborn elevator and a twist of fate that still haunts her dreams. Olivia had always considered herself a practical person. She was the kind of woman who made lists, set reminders, and double-checked her calendar before leaving the house. She worked as a paralegal in a downtown office tower, a job that demanded precision and attention to detail. Her days were filled with paperwork, phone calls, and the steady hum of fluorescent lights. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave her a sense of purpose. The building where she worked was a relic from the 1970s, all concrete and glass, with a lobby that smelled faintly of old coffee and floor polish. The elevators were notorious for their quirks. Sometimes they'd stop on the wrong floor, or the doors would take forever to open. But Olivia had grown used to their idiosyncrasies. She even joked with her co-workers that the elevators had a mind of their own, as if the building itself was alive. It was a Thursday evening in late autumn, the kind of night when the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for winter to arrive. Olivia had stayed late to finish a brief for her boss, determined to get ahead before the weekend. By the time she packed up her things and headed for the elevator, the office was nearly empty. The cleaning crew was just starting their rounds, their carts rattling down the hallway. She pressed the button and waited, listening to the distant whir of machinery as the elevator made its slow ascent. When the doors finally slid open, she stepped inside, grateful for the moment of solitude. She pressed the button for the lobby and leaned against the wall, her mind already drifting to the dinner she'd promised herself as a reward for her hard work. But as the doors began to close, they suddenly jerked open again. Olivia frowned, thinking someone must be rushing to catch the elevator, but the hallway was empty. She pressed the close door button, but nothing happened. The doors remained stubbornly open, the elevator refusing to budge. She tried again, pressing the button harder this time, but the result was the same. The doors stayed open, the elevator silent and unmoving. Olivia sighed, her patience wearing thin. She glanced at her watch, realizing she was already running late. She considered taking the stairs, but she was on the 18th floor, and the thought of trudging down all those steps in her heels was less than appealing. She stepped out into the hallway, looking for a member of the cleaning crew or a security guard who might be able to help. The corridor was deserted, the only sound the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner. She called out, but no one answered. Frustrated, she returned to the elevator, determined to make it work. As she reached for the button again, a strange feeling washed over her, a prickling at the back of her neck, as if she were being watched. She hesitated, her hand hovering in the air. For a moment, she considered ignoring the feeling, chalking it up to nerves or exhaustion. But something deep inside told her to wait, to listen. That's when she heard it, a low, metallic groan from somewhere above, followed by a sharp, snapping sound. The lights in the elevator flickered, then steadied. Olivia's heart began to race. She stepped back, her instincts screaming at her to get away. Suddenly, there was a deafening crash, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the entire building. The elevator cables had snapped, and the car plummeted down the shaft, vanishing into the darkness below. Olivia stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. If the doors had closed when she wanted them to, if the elevator had worked as it should have, she would have been inside. She would have been trapped in that metal box as it hurtled toward the basement, with no chance of escape. The realization hit her like a wave, leaving her breathless and trembling. Within minutes, the building was in chaos. Alarms blared, lights flashed, and people poured into the hallways, their faces pale with shock. The fire department arrived, their radios crackling as they assessed the damage. Olivia found herself surrounded by co-workers and strangers, all asking if she was all right, if she'd seen what happened. She could barely speak, her voice shaking as she recounted the events. The firefighters told her she was lucky, that she'd narrowly avoided a tragedy. The elevator had been overdue for maintenance, they said, and the cables had given way without warning. It was a freak accident, the kind that happened once in a lifetime. But Olivia knew it was more than that. She knew that something, call it fate, luck, or intuition, had kept her from stepping into that elevator at the wrong moment. She replayed the scene over and over in her mind, searching for a reason, an explanation. Why had the doors refused to close? Why had she felt that strange sense of unease, that urge to wait? In the days that followed, Olivia struggled to return to normal. She found herself jumping at every unexpected sound, her nerves frayed and raw. She avoided elevators whenever possible, choosing the stairs even when it meant arriving late or out of breath. Her co-workers tried to reassure her, telling her she was a survivor, that she'd been given a second chance. But Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that she'd come too close, that she'd glimpsed the edge of something dark and unknowable. She started having nightmares, visions of falling, of being trapped in a metal box as it plummeted through the darkness. In her dreams, she could hear the cables snapping, feel the sickening lurch as the elevator dropped. She'd wake up gasping for air, her heart pounding, the memory of the crash echoing in her mind. Her family urged her to see a therapist, and eventually, she agreed. She sat in a small, sunlit office, telling her story to a woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice. The therapist listened patiently, nodding as Olivia described the fear, the guilt, the sense of unreality that lingered long after the accident. "It's normal to feel this way," the therapist said. "You experienced a trauma. Your mind is trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense." Olivia nodded, but she wasn't sure she believed it. She kept searching for meaning, for a reason why she'd been spared. She read articles about near-death experiences, about fate and chance and the mysteries of the universe. She found comfort in the stories of others who had survived against the odds, who had walked away from disaster with a new appreciation for life. Slowly, she began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent, the anxiety less overwhelming. She started taking the elevator again, though she always hesitated before stepping inside, always listened for the faintest sound of trouble. She learned to trust her instincts, to listen to that inner voice that had saved her life. But the memory of that night never left her. It lingered in the back of her mind, a constant reminder of how quickly everything could change. She thought about the people who hadn't been so lucky, about the families who had lost loved ones in accidents just like hers. She wondered why she had been spared, what she was meant to do with the time she'd been given. One evening, months after the accident, Olivia found herself alone in the office again, working late on a case that demanded her full attention. The building was quiet, the city outside shrouded in darkness. She finished her work, packed her bag, and headed for the elevator. As she waited, she felt that familiar prickling at the back of her neck, that sense of being watched. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the button. For a moment, she considered taking the stairs, but then she remembered her therapist's words, "Trust your instincts, but don't let fear control you." The elevator arrived, its doors sliding open with a soft chime. Olivia stepped inside, her heart pounding, but she forced herself to breathe, to stay calm. She pressed the button for the lobby and waited, listening to the hum of the machinery as the car descended. When the doors opened on the ground floor, she stepped out into the lobby, her legs trembling but her spirit unbroken. She realized then that she couldn't live her life in fear, that she had to move forward, to embrace the uncertainty that came with being alive. She walked out into the night, the city lights twinkling above her, and felt a sense of gratitude she'd never known before. She knew that she'd been given a second chance, that she'd escaped death by seconds, and she vowed to make the most of every moment, to live her life with purpose and courage, because sometimes it's the smallest things, a stubborn elevator, a fleeting feeling, a split-second decision, that stand between us and the unthinkable. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. There are stories that linger in the mind long after they're told, stories that make you question the boundaries between coincidence and something more. This is one of those stories, a true account from a woman named Marisol, whose life and the lives of her friends were saved by a warning that came in the dead of night. Whether you believe in fate, intuition, or something supernatural, what happened in that small college apartment is a chilling reminder that sometimes the difference between life and death is measured in seconds, and in the courage to listen to a voice you can't explain. Marisol was in her second year of college, living in a cramped but cheerful apartment with two of her closest friends, Jamie and Priya. The place was nothing special, just a faded brick building on the edge of campus, with creaky floors, drafty windows, and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of burnt toast. But it was theirs, a sanctuary from the chaos of classes, exams, and the relentless pressure to figure out what came next. The three of them had fallen into an easy rhythm, sharing chores, late-night study sessions, and the occasional impromptu dance party in the living room. They were different in almost every way. Marisol was quiet and introspective, Jamie was loud and fearless, and Priya was the glue that held them together, always ready with a joke or a cup of tea. But they shared a bond that felt unbreakable, forged in the fires of shared experience and mutual trust. It was late November, and the first real cold snap of the season had settled over the city. The old radiator in their apartment groaned and clanked, struggling to keep up with the dropping temperatures. Marisol had always been sensitive to the cold, and she found herself piling on sweaters and blankets, her breath visible in the air as she studied at her desk. On the night it happened, the three friends were scattered throughout the apartment. Jamie was in the kitchen, trying to coax the ancient oven into baking a tray of cookies. Priya was curled up on the couch, headphones on, lost in a world of music and textbooks. Marisol was in her bedroom, hunched over her laptop, the glow of the screen the only light in the room. It was just after midnight when Marisol first noticed the smell. It was faint at first, a sharp, chemical tang that seemed out of place. She wrinkled her nose, thinking it was just the oven or maybe the neighbors cooking something strange. But as the minutes passed, the smell grew stronger, more insistent. It made her eyes water and her head ache, a pressure building behind her temples. She got up and opened her window, hoping to let in some fresh air, but the cold wind only made her shiver. She wandered into the hallway, calling out to her roommates. "Do you guys smell that?" she asked, her voice echoing in the silence. Jamie poked her head out of the kitchen, a smudge of flour on her cheek. "Smell what?" "I just burned a batch of cookies, so it might be that." Priya pulled off her headphones, frowning. "I don't smell anything. Maybe it's just the heater acting up again." Marisol shrugged, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in her chest. She went back to her room, but the smell was even stronger now, a sickly sweet odor that made her stomach turn. She tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting, her thoughts growing fuzzy and disjointed. That's when she heard it, a faint, insistent voice, barely more than a whisper. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, the product of too much caffeine and too little sleep. But the voice grew louder, more urgent, repeating the same word over and over. "Leave." Marisol froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. But she was alone, the only sound the hum of her laptop and the distant clatter of the radiator. She tried to ignore the voice, telling herself it was just stress, but it wouldn't go away. It echoed in her mind, relentless and insistent. "Leave, leave, leave." She stood up, her legs trembling, and walked back into the hallway. "Guys, I think we need to get out of here," she said, her voice shaking. Jamie laughed, waving a spatula in the air. "What? Are you scared of my cookies now?" "I'm serious," Marisol said, her eyes wide. "Something's not right. I think there's a gas leak or something. We need to get out." Priya looked at her, concern flickering across her face. "Are you sure? Maybe we should call the landlord." But Marisol was already grabbing her coat, her instincts screaming at her to move. "We can call from outside. Please, just trust me." Something in her voice must have convinced them, because Jamie and Priya didn't argue. They grabbed their jackets and followed her out the door, shivering as the cold night air hit their faces. Marisol fumbled with her phone, dialing the emergency number as they huddled together on the sidewalk. Within minutes, the street was filled with flashing lights and the wail of sirens. Firefighters rushed into the building, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. The three friends watched from a distance, their breath fogging in the air as the firefighters worked. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. There had been a gas leak in the basement, a slow, invisible seepage that had filled the building with deadly fumes. The firefighters told them that if they'd stayed even a few minutes longer, they might not have made it out alive. The gas was odorless at first, but as it built up, it became detectable, a warning sign that most people ignored until it was too late. Marisol listened in stunned silence, her mind racing. She thought about the voice she'd heard, the insistent warning that had driven her from her room. She didn't know where it had come from, her own subconscious, a guardian angel, or something else entirely. All she knew was that it had saved their lives. In the days that followed, the three friends found themselves shaken but grateful. They stayed with a neighbor while the building was repaired, sharing stories and laughter to keep the fear at bay. Marisol tried to explain what had happened, but the words always fell short. How do you describe a voice that only you can hear, a warning that comes from nowhere and everywhere at once? Jamie teased her at first, calling her the gas leak whisperer. But even she grew quiet when the reality of what had happened sank in. Priya, ever the skeptic, tried to find a rational explanation, but even she admitted that something strange had occurred. Marisol found herself thinking about the moments that had led up to the warning, the smell, the headache, the growing sense of unease. She wondered if she'd picked up on something her friends had missed, if her body had known before her mind did. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something watching over them, something that had intervened at the last possible moment. She started paying more attention to her instincts, trusting the little voice inside her that told her when something was wrong. She became more cautious, more aware of her surroundings. She read up on gas leaks and carbon monoxide poisoning, determined never to ignore a warning sign again. But the memory of that night lingered, a constant reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. She thought about the seconds that had separated them from tragedy, the narrow margin between life and death. She wondered how many other people had ignored the signs, how many lives had been lost because someone didn't listen to a voice they couldn't explain. As the weeks passed, the apartment was repaired and the friends moved back in, their bond stronger than ever. They joked about their haunted apartment, but beneath the laughter was a shared understanding, a knowledge that they'd been given a second chance. Marisol never heard the voice again, but she carried its message with her always. She learned to trust her instincts, to listen to the warnings that came in the quiet moments, when the world seemed to hold its breath. She knew that life was fragile, that everything could change in an instant. And sometimes, late at night, when the apartment was silent and the city slept, she'd remember the voice that had saved her life. She'd wonder where it had come from and why it had chosen her. But she knew that some questions didn't have answers, that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. All she could do was live her life with gratitude, cherishing every moment, every breath. Because sometimes, the difference between life and death is measured in seconds, and in the courage to listen to a voice you can't explain.